showing those stories, telling those stories every single day. I've always believed if the media puts these stories front and center, the stories of people, fighting for health care, like you might have heard our story just a few weeks ago with Elizabeth Benjamin, who's Vice President of the Community Service Society in New York, and Hope Rubel, who, how did the Times describe Hope? They didn't say that she was a Democracy Now! Viewer, but she is. But they said, Nina Bernstein wrote a very good piece. This is about New York, but I think it could be about all of the United States. For most of her life, Hope Rubel was a healthy woman with good medical insurance, an unblemished credit history, and a solid career in graphic design. But on the day an ambulance rushed her to a Manhattan hospital emergency room shortly after her 48th birthday, she was jobless, uninsured, and having a stroke. Ms. Rubel's medical problem was rare, a result of a benign tumor on her adrenal gland. But the financial consequences were not unusual. She depleted her savings to pay $17,000 for surgery to remove the tumor and then watched emotionally paralyzed, she said, as $88,000 in additional hospital bills poured in. Eventually, the hospital sued her for the money. Yet that year, the hospital, New York Presbyterian, Weill Cornell, had already collected $50.2 million from New York State's so-called indigent care pool to help care for people like Ms. Rubel, who have no insurance and cannot pay their bills. This is New York's story. New York's charity care system, partly financed by a 8.95% surcharge on hospital bills, is one of the most complicated in the nation. Like New York, several passed laws curbing hospitals' pursuit of unpaid bills, including Illinois, California, and Minnesota. But this new study by Elizabeth Benjamin at the Community Service Society, who we had on with Hope, a study of New York's hospitals' practices and state records finds that most medical centers are violating the rules without consequences, even as the state government ignores glaring problems in the hospital's own reports. The hospitals have gotten something like $460 million to pay for people like Hope. If you go into the hospital and you're brought into a hospital, sometimes you're not conscious, you're not deciding what hospital you're brought into. You're uninsured. The hospital then runs you for money, tries to get money from you, say, I don't know what to do. In 2/3 of the hospitals in New York State, they don't tell you that they have this indigent care program. They don't tell you, they don't give you a financial form that says lay out what your finances are, because they overall the system, they get something like $1.2 billion from the state. But they don't tell you this. Sometimes they put your debt into collections. They give it over to a state collector. They sell your debt. And then they get money for this. And then that gets you a lien on your home, for example, if you own a home. Here you are at your sickest, and you are now destitute. You have a lien on your house. This is a system that I deeply believe Americans across the political spectrum would not stand for if they understood what their neighbors, and so often they themselves are going through, how often this happens in this country. And it's our job in the media and your job as media consumers to demand that these stories get told every single day. Yeah. I put this war on not only poor, because we are talking, in Colorado, 60% of the state's uninsured have jobs. 60% of the state's uninsured have jobs. We're talking not only about the media dealing with life and death issues of the wars abroad, which we must look at, but the war at home. I've always said that if for 1 week all of us and all of the media we run and consume, right? People have their own Facebook pages, we read the newspaper, we go online. If on every Facebook wall, if on the front page of every surviving newspaper in this country, we showed the images of war, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? The babies dead on the ground, the soldiers dead and dying, the women with their legs blown off and thrown in tacks. For just 1 week, if it was the top of every TV and radio newscast, every tweet that you sent out dealt with war in one of these stories. I think Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. I also think that if we did the same thing with the war on the poor at home, and also not only the poor, but the lack of health care in this country, if we made it the topic of everything we did for just 1 week, American people would unite and say, we have to solve this issue. I think that's why the Occupy movement has been so broadly supported in the United States, despite the fact that the corporate media first ignored it, then ridiculed it. It is amazing to think how much support it has gotten, because it is tapping a basic American sentiment, and it is about justice, and it's about a revulsion about inequality. You know the Gandhian phrase, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. That's really a description of what happened in the media. You remember what happened when the first encampment began September 17th in New York, Occupy Wall Street. So Democracy Now! Was the only national media outlet that covered it even before September 17th, because we cover movements. And we saw this was coming, and our reporters were at the meetings and were covering this. Then it took weeks for the media to cover. First they ignored it, and then they started to attack it viciously. I remember watching, it was MSNBC in the morning, and they were saying, if these people had something important to say, they'd have a spokesperson right here. And the problem is they have to be invited in, right? And they said, what on earth are they saying? They have no message. What could be a more powerful message than we are the 99%? It is something... I generally don't drink bottled water. What could be more compelling than we are the 99%? And I also think in terms of sentiment, a number of those in the 1% identify with that statement as well. What's happened in this country is remarkable, and it followed Wisconsin, which followed Egypt, which followed Tunisia. We have seen something the likes of which we haven't seen in the world in this last year. I mean, starting with Tunisia, this utterly frustrated young man came out of the university named Mohamed Bouazizi, whose only job he could find was in the fruit and vegetable marketplace, selling fruit and vegetable. And the authorities started to go after him and harass him. And he was so utterly frustrated when they took his scale away from him that he set himself on fire. And that was the spark that ignited the Tunisian revolution, that then went on to spark the Egyptian revolution. There were other things as well, like WikiLeaks. And we cannot underestimate the power of information when it is made available to us. When the WikiLeaks documents came out, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq diaries, the State Department cables that have come out, people in Tunisia saw that, they knew that their tyrant, that their dictator was corrupt, but they saw that the U.S. understood that as well and continued to support him. And this just infuriated them further. And then you move on to Egypt and what took place there. I mean, maybe many of you lived it each day because of the remarkable reporting of Sharif Abdelkader's Democracy Now! Who just won the Izzy Award from the Park Center for Independent Journalism, named for I.F. Stone. I.F. Stone, who famously said to students, if you're going to remember two words, remember governments lie. In terms of doing good journalism. But there was Sharif, who flew back home. He's an Egyptian American, who flew home as he was getting tweets and texts from home, from people who were not political, from his cousins, from family members, from friends, and I will die for this revolution. And he knew he had to be in a place which he said he both loved and was ashamed of all of his life. And he flew home, and even as he came through the airport and basically landed in Tahrir, he said, this will never be Mubarak's Egypt again. And the revolution began. Because Democracy Now! Has always been very creative, not having the financial resources of the networks. When they send, during Saddam Hussein's Iraq, when he had a firewall up, they were giving him millions of dollars to send on his satellites their video. Democracy Now! And Jeremy Scahill was in Iraq reporting for us during Saddam Hussein's time. He and Jackie Sawin of Big Noise Films were going into internet cafes. They would have video reports that they would send through 150 emails, broken apart, using a computer program. We would piece it back together on our end and run it. So when Mubarak took down the internet in Egypt, Sharif had a way to get around it, and he became one of the top tweeters in the world. He had a joke, Sharif. He said that, Mubarak's downfall was taking down the internet. He said, because after all, we're Egyptian. We were all home. You're tweeting. You're on Facebook. He says, you're on the internet. And then he took down the internet, Mubarak did, and so we all had to go outside and see what was going on. So, Tahrir just happens, and young people, older people, whole families. The internet then went back up, but the thugs went after the satellites. So you had people like Anderson Cooper of CNN in his hotel room, and he would be looking like Dimash now on Skype. And it would be saying, the lower third would be saying, reporting from an undisclosed location. And there was Sharif naming himself in the middle of Tahrir, saying, I'm in the safest place in Egypt. And he was reporting for all the networks, and the networks were reporting, showing his tweets. CNN was showing what he was saying each day, as he was bringing out the voices of people in Tahrir. And through him, you met Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old doctor who ran for president, who was imprisoned under Sadat, who was in exile under Mubarak, this remarkable woman who had run for president in Egypt. You met Hadeh Souek, the great writer who wrote Map of Love, as she described leaving Tahrir, and when they heard Mubarak fell, she had been with two very pregnant women. She said, now they can give birth to freedom. You met the young high school student who was putting out these broadsheet voices of Tahrir in the shadow of the state media building that had controlled the images for so long. You met people that could have been your aunt, your uncle, your mother, your father. He made it personal. He made this world revolution as if it could be happening in your own family. And he introduced you. This is the power of grassroots media, is showing the way grassroots action happens through everyday people, this extraordinary event. And that's the gift that Sharif gave us. So working with Hani Massoud, another of our producers who had been on the Egyptian basketball team, who was leaping buildings in a single bound as he had his video camera, and Sharif would stay there all night. Sharif is the grandson of the most famous writer in Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Qaddus. And any Egyptian here will certainly know his name. He's sort of considered like the Mark Twain of Egypt. And his great-grandmother is Rosal Youssef, who's a great feminist who founded the magazine by that name, Rosal Youssef, which exists today. And there he was translating what was happening in his country for all of us. That was Egypt, and then there was Libya, and now there is the agony of Syria, which we continue to have to deal with, and the world must deal with when you have a crisis like this with the thousands of people being killed. And that cannot be separated from how the U.S. is dealing with Iran right now. Is there no memory? I mean, does this remind you of 2002 and 2003? Weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, when in fact he did not. In Iran, they are getting a nuclear weapon. When if you listen to the most belligerent country in dealing with Iran, Israel, that continually is threatening to bomb Iran, their own heads of Mossad have said they will not be getting a nuclear weapon for years. And yet, we continue to say this. As if when pulling out of Afghanistan that we cannot pull out soon enough, and pulling out of Iraq, we must have some country that we are attacking. We need to attack the serious problems right here at home.